Benvenuti al Christian Podcast.
Well, hello my friends. My name is Beto Gudino. Welcome to the Christian Podcast. Today I thought I would do something a little different because I'm like 3 minutes prior to start a podcast with Koch, who is a podcaster, many more things, but he's got a podcast named You Have Permission Podcast, and he's also had a podcast previously that I used to listen to a lot called Depolarize. But I thought, what if I start recording and say hello to the audience even before he comes on, and then we kind of walk through the process of opening the chat and all of that. And I don't know, I feel like it could be interesting. So normally I do my calls through Zoom. And by the way, if you're watching this on Roku, thank you so much for watching. I think it's one of the most the better outlets that we have right now for our video. Would highly recommend if you would, or request if you would like to give us a review on Spotify or iTunes. Check it out, the podcast there too, Christian Podcast, and leave a positive review, leave some stars, leave us a comment. You can visit anchor.fm/Christian Podcast, and we're there too. And that's actually a place where you can support the show through Anchor. You can support the show so simple with $1, $4 or $9 a month. So would totally welcome anyone that wants to support the show. It will help produce more episodes. This all requires, as you might look around and think, it requires technology and a little bit of investment. Not super much, but nonetheless, we'd appreciate all of your support for the conversations that we are creating for the 21st century. I believe Christian Podcast is about conversation more than anything else. It's about bringing the questions to the table and then going around and listening to each other rather than trying to make a cross. This is my point of view, listen to it, you should believe like I believe. No, I think I have a way different approach. So anyways, let me see if Koch is close. I'm excited. This is going to be a good show. It's going to be a great episode. I'm not wearing a hat. And here he comes. Right there. Admit. There he is. He's got way more stuff than I do. Way more guitars, way more production and technology, and way more babies.
True. Well, I mean, I only have one baby, so I don't have way more babies.
Way more because my kids are older, so you win because I don't have babies anymore.
No babies anymore, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you use the video or just audio?
I use the video.
Okay, I'm gonna put a background on then because this is very messy.
Okay, we're gonna delete that then.
Okay.
I was starting the podcast before you came on, so wow, look at that.
I see. You can leave it in. That's fine. People can hear me scrambling to see how embarrassed I need to be. I do. Yeah, it's my music studio, which is my day job, and it's also got like you said, a little play area for my son who's about to turn 1, and nice. Also it's just got some garbage, packaging from a computer and stuff that I haven't taken care of yet, and that's a little bit embarrassing. But that's fine.
No worries, man. No worries. Plus, I love all the books back there, man. Just tell me about the books.
Well, this is not real. I don't know whose books these are. In the real background, I got a bunch of records. My books are in the other room.
Oh, I thought it was a picture you took of your actual living room and just
no way.
Overimposed it.
This is some kind of this is some kind of beautiful mansion. This is not my house.
Nice. Love it, man. Well, thank you for coming on the show, man. I appreciate it. My name is Beto Gudino. Would love to introduce myself to you. Finally, right here on the screen. I mean, I almost feel like I want to reach my hand out and go like this.
Yes, we can.
Virtual handshake. There we go. So I was telling the audience even before we started a little bit about how I found you, that a while back I was listening to this thing called the Depolarized Podcast.
Yeah.
And I thought, man, this is phenomenal. I think you're brilliant. I think you have, like very opinionated and substantiated ways and points of view. So I thought, later on I found out, wow, now he's got the You Have Permission podcast. So a little bit of what I'm trying to do here with Christian Podcast is kind of feature other podcasts that are under that, like kind of like Christianity label when you go to iTunes and Spotify. Yeah. And just talk to the podcasters and see what they're a little bit about. But all that to say, I always feel like I want to get to know you a little bit more than just tell me what your podcast is. And I'm growing too, I'm on like my 21st episode, so I consider you like a legend already.
Wow, it doesn't take much to become a podcasting legend.
Yeah.
Compared to other, being an author or a filmmaker or an athlete, all you got to do to be a podcasting legend is just like make a few hundred episodes and then you get legend status. I'll take it. Yeah.
Legend status, man. In my list, you're already a legend. And plus, I don't really follow sports anymore. I used to, though.
Too busy listening to every podcast on the Christianity charts?
Pretty much. I came from Guadalajara, Mexico, so I was a big fan of my team called Chivas.
Yeah.
But then
Chivas, Mexico, yeah.
Yeah, but then here in the US, soccer was not really a thing. I mean, it is, but it is not. So it's weird.
Isn't there a second Chivas team that's like in California? That's in the MLS or something?
They were, but they didn't make it, so now it's gone.
Oh, bummer. I'm from San Jose, California, actually. So where are you in California?
I'm in Southern California in Costa Mesa.
In Costa Mesa.
So it's Orange County.
Yeah.
Nice, man. Well, we'd love to get to know you a little bit before we talk about your podcast and like all these questions I have about like deconstruction and your website and stuff. But yeah, tell me a little bit about
Okay,
your
so
background.
I was in a band for 10 years called Sherwood. So I dropped out of college after 3 years to play in this rock band, and we toured and we put out 3 records at that time, and played all over the world, went to Japan, went to the UK and Europe, toured the US and Canada like something like 15 times. I lost count. And out of that, I made friendships with other bands, and some of those closer friends were the guys in a band called Emery, and they started a podcast called Bad Christian. And so I started coming as a guest onto their show, and I kind of got a taste, and I was like, hey, I think I like doing this. I like podcasting. So I started up Depolarized. That was my first show, which you mentioned earlier, which was about politics and psychology, a little bit of religion. I always wanted to talk about religion, Christianity specifically, but what didn't always make sense. So sometimes I'm kind of shoehorning that into episodes that don't, it's not really what the show is about. And eventually I stopped doing that. And I had another podcast with a buddy that was around Christian questions called Reconstruct, but we were kind of on each other's schedule, and that moved a bit slower. So eventually I was like, I'm going to start my own show about Christianity, and that's You Have Permission. And so my background is I am now studying to be a psychologist. So I always assumed that I would become a theologian of some, or at least I would go to school for theology, maybe not be a theologian, but try and be a professor or something. But that's a really bad job market. It's very hard to find a job in that world. And I started, because of Depolarize, thinking about politics. It led me to psychology. And I thought, wow, this is so interesting. I think that the answers, the descriptions that psychology gives me are kind of more satisfying for the questions that I'm asking than the descriptions that theology gives me. So I still love theology as much as I did, but a lot of the stuff that I want to figure out, I have been finding over the last 4 or 5 years that I find myself looking to psychology a bit more often, to describe the world that I find myself in, and human behavior and and why progressive and traditional Christians disagree and dislike each other so much, and why did people vote for Trump, and why, like all those kind of questions. I just keep finding psychology is pointing me in the direction that's a bit more satisfying, a bit more meat on the bone. And so I continue this show, you have permission, dealing with faith questions, but a lot of psychology comes in, and eventually that will be my career.
Yeah, and your show is brilliant, man. I feel like it's a little bit out of my scope, but basically you're saying, and I'm just kind of going back a little bit to your introduction of being in a band called Sherwood. Yeah. So you're saying that it's harder to make it in psychology, but it's easier to be in a band traveling around the world?
No. Well, yeah. So that was, I mean, we were obviously very lucky. We were a good band. And I had played my little part in that. I was a fifth of that band being good. But also we didn't have any families. None of us were married during those years. We didn't really have any expenses. And so to try and make a living out of that today would be impossible. And so I actually, for my day job, you saw the guitars earlier. I write music for advertisements. So that's how I pay the bills right now. And then eventually I'll be a psychologist, and that will be how I pay the bills. So I did figure out a way to make money with music, but it wasn't on tour. And so when I say that theology would be hard, I mean, if I'm going to stop doing music and I'm going to go do theology, or I'm going to go do psychology, psychology is a much easier way to support a family than theology, because there are very few jobs.
Nice. Well, I want to tell you, as you were saying psychology, just kind of like a funny story. Yeah. Kind of like an icebreaker type of thing. But when I was in high school, which, well, I don't know your age, but I'm going to be 40 this year.
I'm 37.
Yeah. Okay. So in high school was around like 1997 or 98.
Yeah.
And a funny thing is, how you go to school and then they have this test where they're trying to, okay, you could be good at this or you could be good at that. I don't know what it's called in English, but this is a high school in Mexico, right? So I go through that test, I do it, and then like a couple weeks later, the teacher comes to me and is like, hey, I want to sit down with you. And she says, Beto or Humberto, felicidades, congratulations. You could do anything you want. The test came back, and I don't know if she meant like I'm brilliant or something, but she's like, you could do whatever you want, right? So
That's awesome.
Okay, but then she said this, but if you want something specific, you would be really good in psychology. And I was like, what? I was super young, like a little bit of a rebel and whatnot, and I thought, are you kidding me? The test must be wrong. That's not at all who I am. Has nothing to do, no aspiration whatsoever to psychology. And now, a little bit kind of like you, I find myself a little bit more like asking the questions. And not that I don't have a psychology background or anything.
Right.
But I do feel like, wow, there's a lot about just how we interact with each other as humans, like psychology or even sociology, right? And all these things.
Right.
But I feel like it's true. I mean, it's just kind of like, to me, it's so interesting, and I feel like a little bit of what you're doing with your podcast and your questions is, I can totally see why you're pursuing psychology.
And if the fact that you like the podcast means that you do have a fair amount of interest in that stuff, or else you wouldn't like it, right?
Yeah, that's true. Because one of the questions I want to ask, and maybe this is the way right now, this is a good spot, because first, I want to say with this type of shows, I don't necessarily have an agenda that I want to pursue other than, I have a few questions here.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit more of a like a rabbit trail, just pulling on the thread.
I can do that, yeah.
So, just forgot what we were saying.
You said this would be a nice transition to the following question.
Yeah, I forgot what the question was. Yeah. Oh, man. I guess it was... psychology. Oh yeah, the question is this, because I'm interested in You Have Permission podcast. Like, who is like the typical listener of You Have Permission? What's your audience?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I've actually done a little bit of research on this, and I had like a poll that I had the patrons of the show take, and so those are the people who support it financially, and they might be a little different than the average listener, but they're probably pretty similar. So one thing I find is they're almost all white.
Wow.
And I don't like that, and that's been getting a little better. But it's still largely white. Pretty
If
good
it
mix.
helps, I listen to it, and I'm from Mexico.
Right.
So
that's good. Yeah, you've got that Hispanic origin helping me offset it there a little bit. So they've or is it? So if you're from Mexico, you could be Hispanic, but it's also Latino.
yeah,
Right? Not everybody from Mexico is Hispanic.
I have that's a big question for me, because even here I feel like, what am I? Because in Mexico, all we knew is we're mestizos, which means mixed.
Yeah.
And it made perfect sense, because okay, we don't need to identify specifically with a race.
Yeah.
It's like we're just a mixture, and that's how I would describe myself. So, but then in America, I do find that you're white, you're black, or you're all this other stuff, and I feel like sometimes people do confuse, Hispanic heritage or even speaking Spanish with, oh, that's your race. I'm like, wow, I don't think that's my race, but yeah, it could be super confusing.
Yeah, I get it wrong, but I think that in the States we would say that there can be people of Spanish descent who are considered white, so they're Hispanic. But if you have like indigenous descent from Latin America, then that's Latino. And so you could be both, or you could be one or the other, or both. I think. I don't really understand it. Anyway, that's probably a waste of time. But so a lot of white listeners, pretty good mix of men and women, but I think more men. I think what you're probably getting at really is more like, I would imagine what you're asking is, where do they stand kind of in religiously? Is that what you
all of
mean?
it, man. I like the stats. Okay. I like the stats.
You're interested in the stats. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, good. So the average listener of You Have Permission is probably like 30, maybe 30 to 40, and is a former evangelical. I would say the average listener is somebody who was raised evangelical Christian and does not identify as evangelical anymore, but probably does identify as Christian. That's I'm thinking of kind of like the average listener, right? So yeah, 30-ish, still Christian, but not the same kind of Christian they were raised. Theologically, somewhat liberal. So very few people that listen to the show self-identify as conservative theologically. Some of them identify as like very liberal, but more than that would identify as like somewhat liberal. Wow. Theologically, and probably somewhat liberal politically. So more Democrats than Republicans, but there is a mix on that. And there's a lot of independents, people who don't really identify with either party. What else? What do I know about them? It's kind of bad timing. I wish that if we had done this in like a week or two. I'm having an interview with my editor who combed through all that data and like pulled a bunch of talking points out, and we're going to discuss it as an episode for the patrons. And so I would have way more of this in the top of my head if we had already done that, but that's a start.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess another good question would be kind of like in the same theme of who the audience is. It would be kind of like, how did you end up in this position where you need to have a podcast for this type of audience? Like, what's your journey? How did you end up on this side? Or, how would you define your own theology or your own, stance politically and all of that?
I think that this is something that I think that a Mexican high schooler and a Californian high schooler might have had in common. Did you listen to punk rock when you were in high school?
Yeah, a little bit, especially what was it? Blink 182 and stuff
Blink.
like that. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So for me, a lot of this comes back to my first identity as a teenager being like a punk kid. And there is a part of me that still really resonates with that and identifies with that. And one of the things that I was finding as my own faith, so I studied philosophy in college, and
Nice.
I'm sure we're gonna talk more explicitly about faith deconstruction and reconstruction and all of that. But for me, they basically always happened pretty close to each other. I never deconstructed all the way down to the ground. I never really didn't consider myself a Christian. Maybe a couple months in college when I was like really depressed, and it wasn't really what it was about. I don't think. I think there was something else going on, and so it's more been like a piece of this, a piece of that as I go along, as I learn more, as I live more, as I talk with smart people, and as I grow up, basically. And so one thing that I found when I got to a certain point of recognizing, oh, I'm basically I'm a progressive Christian. I have a liberal theology, in the classic sense. I started really recognizing how often people in more conservative circles would kind of demonize that and would use actually really bad arguments against it. So they would say, oh, liberals are caving to secular culture and they just want to be accepted by mainstream culture. And so they are giving up their faith, to fit in or something. And I started looking around and I was like, there's some pretty weird conservative culture, like, I don't know, being obsessed with guns, being obsessed with war and militarism, in the last 5 years, like rabidly supporting Donald Trump. These are cultural forces as well. And it looks to me like people on the right are caving to that culture. And so it's not so clear that we can just label one side as wrong and heretics and whatever. And so that made me want to say, like, you have permission. Like, I felt like a lot of people, especially if you grow up in a more strict environment, it is heavily implied that you do not have permission to consider other ways of being a Christian, other ways of being a human being. And I felt like you do have permission to do that. Like, says who? Like plenty of Christians have liberal theological beliefs. I think Martin Luther King was kind of liberal theologically, Martin Luther King Jr., right? Like, so that's kind of what brought me there, of just like a little bit of a punk rock thing of like, no, you can't tell people that they're not allowed to use their mind and heart in the service of discovering the truth in God's world. And so I think that's what brought me. That's a good question. That's what brought me to starting this show.
Mm-hmm. Wow, man, that's good. And I wonder also if, as you talk about kind of like theologically progressive, and conservative, is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Right. But then is that kind of like translated equally to when it comes to like politics? I mean, if you're culturally conservative, does that mean you're kind of like theologically conservative too? What's your experience? What have you noticed as you have asked questions to like all these, smart people?
That is a really good question. And what I think that we have seen is that increasingly that is true. Yes, they are aligned with each other, and they haven't always been that way. And so that is actually one of the forces that I think people do cave to. They cave to culture in that sense. And I think that people on the left and right both do this, that increasingly these days, almost everything about us fits into one of those two boxes. So I'm likely to be, I wear camo, I drive a truck, I like to hunt, I vote for Republicans, my theology is traditionally conservative, and whatever. And let's see what else. I like Duck Dynasty, and I like, the Jack Reacher movies or something. Fill it in however you want. Or on the other side, and I live in a rural setting or, deep suburbs, or I'm urban, I am politically liberal, I drive a Prius, or I wish I drove a Prius or an electric car. I don't wear camo. I wear like J. Crew, like well-fitted clothes or Gap or something. I listen to urban music, so I listen to hip hop. Don't listen to country. Fill it in, right? So, and my theology is more progressive, and my politics are progressive. And I think it's really sad. I think it's sad that we keep seeing that more and more and more and more, and there are no current signs of that slowing down, as far as I can tell. But that wasn't true like 50 years ago, for instance. That was not true. Those things were not all lined up in the same way they are now 60 years ago. And so myself, I am quite liberal theologically, but I'm actually I'm only kind of center left politically. I'm a bit of a moderate politically. And part of that is because I have been really convinced by the writings of a lot of psychologists and political scientists that we have to be very careful about the stuff that we assume is true because everybody around us believes that it's true. And so the fact that we are in these two silos, these two groups, more and more and more and more on every single part of our life, that distorts our image of reality. And so we have to question that. And so I have had to question that, and it's brought me more to the middle in a political sense. But I guess my theological reasoning has not shifted all that much. Maybe it should. Maybe I should be more theologically in the center. I'm not sure. Maybe that'll come next.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Interesting, man. Well, first, I feel like a lot of this has to do with Christianity in the West, right? Like I was just listening to this guy, and I forgot his exact last name, but I think it's I have it wrong, but he's the author of this book I have right here, Unsettling Truths. So Unsettling Truths, he co-authored the book with let me see. Oh yeah, Mark Charles. Okay, so Mark Charles is
Mark Charles. He's indigenous theologian, or historian, or
Yeah, he was on the podcast on our show. Was one of my first episodes.
Cool.
But then he co-wrote the book with this other guy named it's hard, man, but Sung Chang.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to get it right. Sung Chang. And so anyways, we were in this conversation with a bunch of pastors, mostly from the United States and Canada, right? Mm-hmm. And then Sung Chang is saying how Christianity in the world now is super interesting, because he's saying the global South, right? There basically Christianity is there's kind of like a division, or you can get it to know like the Western Christianity, right? Yeah. United States, England, Europe. It's all kind of like coming to the end. But then there's the global South, and what they're saying was super interesting is the global South now has the majority of Christians in the world, right? More than the U.S., more than the Western Christianity. But he's saying, but Western Christianity still has a hold on power and culture. Yeah. And I was
we're still exporting Western ideas to the global South through basically we have more sophisticated media, we have more money, and so a lot of the rest of the world still looks to us as the best example or something like that. And I think that that's kind of silly in a lot of ways. And just because we have money doesn't really mean that we have better theology. Doesn't mean that we're closer to God. That's actually something very cool about what you're doing, is that you are kind of a bridge, because of your background, between the Western church and at least the Latin American church. I'm sure plenty of Latino Christians speak enough English to listen to your show and enjoy it, and have a bit more of a connection to you than they would to me, for instance. You've lived a closer version of their experience than I have. So that's actually that gets me very excited about your work, because I just feel like I have no access, to that.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. And I feel like that's been a little bit of when I started the podcast, well, first, this isn't what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was just have a website which would just feature like all these podcasts, right? Almost like when you go to Spotify and all these podcasts under Christianity. But then I thought, okay, this is going to be a massive endeavor for me. Maybe I'm just going to start my podcast. And I do have a background in communications. So there is some sort of like passion, for this type of thing. And funny thing, going all the way back to how you introduced yourself, I used to do interviews for like Christian bands and stuff here in the US.
Oh, nice.
And one of the bands I interviewed at one point was Emery.
Yeah.
And actually I ended up listening to the Bad Christian Podcast, right? And to me, I feel like they are like the papas of Christian podcasts, right? I feel like they started it all, at least the conversational side of it, right?
I mean, there are some people who did it earlier, like Trip Fuller from Homebrewed Christianity. He's been going for almost 15 years now.
Wow.
So he is really at the beginning, but that is more of like a seminary level, very academic kind of conversation for the most part. Whereas Bad Christian is like super casual, They did go to college, but they do everything they can to talk like they didn't go to college, that kind of thing. And they're good buddies of mine, so I can give them a hard time. But you should I wonder, do you do any stuff with Spanish language Christian podcasts as well?
Well, I do have one episode with a podcast that's in Spanish. Yeah. But the funny thing is they're in Peru, but they're both American pastors who moved to Peru like 38 years ago. Okay. So their podcast is in Spanish, but on my show they were speaking English because it was comfortable for them to do. But I do want to do more of like Spanish stuff. I mean, I think
if I were you, I would have the two branches, and I would do a both. I mean, obviously, I'm not trying to double your workload or whatever, but like you're at a cool little, you're at a very interesting place, and I think that you could even bring together conversations between English-speaking Latin American podcasters and Western podcasters with you hosting, and talking about their different experiences, the way that their shows are received, the kind of stuff that they learn from the people who are in their lives day to day, where they live. I mean, it's just you've got a pretty unique little placement here.
I'm gonna take you up on your advice, man. And actually, maybe one question, because you have more than 100 episodes of experience, man. So, would you, if I do a podcast in Spanish, do you think it should be, I mean, branch it out, but at the same time, would it be on the same feed as this podcast, or would I have to separate it?
Two feeds, I think. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And you just mention at the top of every show that you have both, and so bilingual people like yourself could listen to both and just choose which one, whoever they're interested in hearing from, and they have the choice, and then people like me could listen to the English ones only or whatever. It's a pretty cool idea though, dude. I mean, you could take some of the stuff that those, and those guys, Mark and Sung Cha, are not the only ones. I mean, there's a whole slew of theologians and church historians and stuff who are working on this stuff, on like, how do we move past colonialism, to something else. And there's some really, really good, really interesting work going on, like in the academy on those issues. And I've talked with the people here and there about it on the various podcasts of mine. It's not an area that I've spent a ton of time on, but I know that really cool work is being done, and you're like incredibly well positioned to actually like do some of that work, get those conversations going.
I'm gonna do it, man. I'm gonna do it. I'm on it. Love it. Yeah. Heck yeah.
I don't really know if people swear on your show or not. We swear on my show sometimes, but I try and keep it.
Is heck swearing?
No, heck's not. I was gonna say hell yeah, because that's how I talk. But I don't know. Maybe that turns some people off.
My brother used to say that all the time. No, from Mexico, we've been here, and he's like, hell, or whatever, or heck. But he was funny. He was just a funny story about my brother. He's in Mexico, but he used to be really careful when he used the word beach because he couldn't pronounce it very well. So it's like every time it's like, we're going to the beach. It's okay, man. We get it.
Yeah.
The ocean. Just say the ocean.
Yeah. We're going to the ocean. Yeah.
Yeah. It's okay, man. I don't mind cussing. I don't know if I do it or not, but whatever.
You're just making. I have such a California white boy relationship to Mexico, but have spent a good amount of time there. Sherwood lived there for a month and a half at one point when we were making one of our records. And I've been, I don't know, 12 times or something to Mexico in my life. And you just talking about the beach makes me think of just the Tijuana beach and some of the taco stands there. Oh my goodness. I mean, I can picture this place and I just miss Mexican tacos. If I'm ever in San Diego, I drive as close to the border as I can and I get, whatever I can find that is like as authentic as possible. It's just like maybe my favorite food in the world is a taco in Mexico. It might be my number one food item.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think the same for me, man. Even though if you are around Orange County at all, come over and I'll take you to some really good places here in the area.
Now,
even to my house, man, because my wife knows how to cook Mexican stuff.
My turn to take you up on something. That's what I'll do next time I'm in OC.
Nice. I love it, man. Well, let's go back a little bit to you have permission and all these like deconstruction ideas. I feel like one of the bigger questions in my mind, because we've talked about progressive and conservative and stuff, what would be some of the like 2 or 3 key elements of either or, right?
Yeah. So a big one these days is biblical inerrancy. So a more conservative view is that some version of the Bible is inerrant, meaning whether it's the Bible we have today or if it's the original manuscript before translations and before, copying errors, some version of the Bible God ensured would have no mistakes in it, that it would never say anything wrong about anything that it's talking about. And there are different ways of interpreting that. Like you might say, well, it could be wrong about science or history because that's not what it's talking about in this passage. But a liberal Christian would, like myself, would look at something like in Joshua and Judges, where God commands the Israelites to kill everybody in Canaan, that's just false, that God did not do that. God is not the kind of God that would actually command something like that. Whereas if you were committed to inerrancy, then you would have to say something like, well, God did command it, and we just must not understand why he did, and maybe here's an option or here's an option. Whereas a non-inerrantist can go, oh yeah, they got that wrong. That's not what God is like. That's not what God's like. And we know that because of Jesus, or we know that because of, whatever. Right.
Wow.
So inerrancy is a big one. Inerrancy is a big one.
Yeah.
If you go, but what's interesting about that is that's really only a big divider since in like the last 100 to 200 years. Earlier than that, when fewer people were literate, that was not what separated liberals and conservatives. But that is often what does separate us today. Another one would be gender and sexuality questions. So some conservatives do affirm women as preachers, as ministers, and they ordain women. So the Foursquare denomination is a pretty conservative denomination, but they do ordain women, and there's a handful of others. Whereas all the liberal denominations ordain women, and then the only liberal denominations will be LGBTQ affirming. So they will say it's not the gender of the person you're having sex with that makes it sinful or not. It is, other things about selfishness or whatever else that would make sex sinful. Whereas conservative or traditional Christians would say, no, the Bible says that homosexual and other, non-straight sex is wrong in God's eyes. So that's another big distinction. And then maybe another one that's, and for a lot of these, if you actually broke it down, all the different denominations, it's a little more complicated than I'm making it out to be. And especially Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy really complicate things, because Catholics do not believe in inerrancy, for instance, but a lot of Catholics are very conservative. So in that sense, it's more like, well, do you like the Council of Trent, or do you like Vatican II? Do you like Pope Francis, or did you prefer Benedict? So Catholicism kind of has its own internal conversation. I'm mostly talking about Protestantism, where when we disagree, we start new denominations and then we fight with each other. So
Wow.
that's okay. So that's the basic landscape.
Wow, that's so interesting, man. I come from a branch or whatever of Christianity from Mexico, which would be probably Protestantism.
Yeah.
But then what I also found that it's just odd a little bit, but now that I've been here in America for like 15 years, it kind of helps me understand where America is at culturally and with religion and Christianity. But,
I bet it would. Yeah.
Because in Mexico, being a Christian, like being a follower of Jesus, was already something that you had to do on the fringes, on the margins, because the nominal religion in Mexico is Catholic, right? So
Right.
90 whatever percent of people of the population in Mexico would say, "Oh, I'm Catholic." Why? Oh, because that's the only option, right? and
Right.
But it's almost like the same thing that happens here in America in a couple years, until before COVID at least, where the nominal Christian shows up at church, 2 times a year. That's exactly what happened in Mexico, right? For that type of Christianity.
Yep.
But then if you're following like Jesus in this, I don't know if authentic way, or I don't know what the word is.
Sure.
But it felt genuine to me, right? And I feel like in America there's a little bit of that confusion of are we a religion? Are we just a way of thinking? And then it's embedded a little bit with nationalism and kind of what you were mentioning at the beginning.
Yep.
Totally confusing, man. What's happened next?
It's
what
very
happens
complicated.
next?
I wish I knew. I mean, so did you have friends who were Catholics that were really sincere Catholics, or most of your Catholic friends were nominal?
Most, I would say, were nominal.
Yeah.
But I do feel like there were a lot of sincere Catholics, and actually my wife, she was Catholic, and then she ended up, kind of like converting or becoming Christian or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, I feel like because it's based on Christianity, right, and on Jesus, I feel like a lot of the values are the same, right? So I feel like there's a lot of common ground.
I got very close to becoming Catholic myself. I almost became a Catholic about 3 years ago.
Wow.
And I have an episode about this coming out soon, where one of our Catholic listeners interviews me about it, and I sort of reverse interview him a little bit as well about how he became Catholic. But I think that you just find nominal Christians anywhere that there is a wide enough acceptance of Christianity, just like I'm sure you find nominal Buddhists, nominal Muslims. Anytime that like there is a majority religion, you're going to have a bunch of nominal religionists, basically. Like, you're going to have the people who do it because it is a part of their culture, and then you'll always have the smaller portion of people who are really committed to it. And I think that's probably just like a rule of human societies. I mean, I would guess. I think you probably cannot find any exceptions to that. So for me, Catholicism is, in my mind, is undoubtedly Christianity. It is a different tradition. It makes some different assumptions. It has different, some of the same founding theologians as Protestantism, but some differences as well. But most Protestants will quote Aquinas or Augustine or, all these guys who were doing their work when it was still Catholicism, basically. Although an Eastern Orthodox would quibble with that because it was actually the United Church, and then it becomes Catholicism when they leave in the 11th century. So that's all gets complicated too. But to me, so one of the questions that people ask me a lot of times is, well, what is it? Who's a Christian? Who counts as a Christian? And my answer is simple. It's just anybody who says Jesus is Lord. That makes you a Christian. And you might mean different things by it, but that's good enough for me. And yeah. So, but I have that's a pretty open definition. I think other people have more rigorous ones.
Yeah. Interesting, man, because I feel like a little bit of my journey has dealt with deconstruction. And probably because I started working here at this church, Palm Harvest in Costa Mesa, about 3 or 4 years ago. So not that it was bad or anything. It was actually phenomenal. It was like the first time I was ever getting paid to do things I loved. Yeah. But at the same time, I was wrestling with the idea of, wow, now I'm getting paid to do things I love, when all my life, even when I was in Mexico, even here in America, I've done these things out of just volunteer, right? I've been the guy that plays the song or sings worship or leads people, into the presence of God or whatever, because it's just part of my heart's desire, right? Yeah. But I had to wrestle with these, and then I feel like, that's why I've been listening to like podcasts, reading books, listening to even like these guys from Emory, right? I feel like they, in a sense, like they pointed people to like that deconstruction, because, well, their story, right? They used to be worship pastors or whatever at some church.
Yeah, both of them.
Right. Yep. So I feel like now that I'm at least on this stage, not that I have overcome, my deconstruction, or maybe I did start reconstructing and didn't even notice, but I feel like my only theology gets summarized super simple, but it cost me everything. It cost me everything to come to these two conclusions. It's not lightly at all that I say these two. I said, wow, Jesus is God and God is good. And as cheesy as that sounds, God is good. I feel like these are my two true statements that I feel like I'm going to live by the rest of my life.
I love that. I love those. And I would say, really for me, God is good has become the most foundational. Like if I was going to take your two, and I would say some days I think Jesus is God. Some days I think Jesus points me to God, points us to God. I waffle because I have more doubt some days than other days. But what my faith is, whether or not I'm doubting it, when I believe it, it is that God is good, and that I experience that God through Jesus. That's probably the most succinct way to say it for me. Wow. And there are days when I doubt that God is good, of course. I have days where I don't know if God's good, and maybe this is all just a big trick, and or we are deceiving ourselves or whatever. But most of the time, I recognize that my experience of God is indeed that God is just completely unending love, and just total regard for me and my family and my community and my world, and a love for all of God's creatures, and that when I share in that, when I treat God's creatures that way, when I value them the way that I think God values them, that's when things make sense. That's when things go better. That's when my life looks the way I want my life to look. That's when, that's when I lose my life, I gain it, to use Jesus's language, right? So it's beautiful the way you said it too.
Thank you, Dan. Well, as I'm thinking of, what you said at the beginning, that you do have a little baby and God is good, or you have found that statement to become truth. I think I heard, it might have been maybe in a Bad Christian episode long ago. I don't know where, man, but I think there was some sort of like a struggle to have children, something like that.
Yeah, my wife and I, yes.
Okay, because now I've kind of followed you on Instagram, and I feel like, wow, this guy is in love with this little boy.
Yeah. Yeah, we had 3 years of infertility. We had 4 miscarriages in a row. They were all early miscarriages. So I now know I actually can't imagine, 20 weeks or something like that, which we've had many friends. Ours were more like 7 to 12 weeks, 1 surgery in there for my wife. And that was really hard, man. And it also happened at the same time that some stuff with my family was going on that was really hard. And that was just the darkest few years of my life, probably. And but there were moments of God in there for sure. I mean, my theological conviction is that God is with the people who are suffering just as much as God is with people who are rejoicing. And I do think God was with us. And there is evidence of that. Like, for instance, in the way that we chose to go forward with IVF, which I know is controversial, and actually I have some pretty strong feelings around it. But given what I knew about our situation, I felt comfortable with it, and so did my wife. But there was like a prayer moment as part of that felt really confirming. And there was a conversation with a very loving friend that I think God spoke through. And then, of course, we had Soren, healthy and happy. And the day he was born is the best day of my life. And I always tell my wife, I'm sorry to say that, but it easily beat out our wedding. And even though we had a great wedding,
Wow.
and I can't think about my faith without thinking about my son being born and thinking about how fatherhood is changing my theology, or filling it in or giving me better metaphors. I don't know how to say it exactly. You probably know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I have 3 kids, man. I know parenting changed me for sure.
Yeah.
I feel like it gave me a brand new perspective. I remember one time asking, my oldest was super young, was probably like maybe 1 or 2, I don't remember. And my dad was visiting from Mexico. And I remember asking my dad, like, Dad, was it like this when I was little? I mean, did you have to like pay all this care and attention and feel like, man, I got to make sure this kid survives and, kind of like provide and give all these opportunities for this little boy? And he's like, well, he told me one story again from my brother. He's like, one time, he just started thinking, right, about this, well, when we were young. And he's like, yeah, one time your brother, he just said one day, when he was, 11, 12 or whatever, I wanna go on my bike to the ramps, right? In Mexico, there was a place that was super popular because back in the days was the 80s, and BMX was huge, right? It was massive, the GT bikes and all of that. And he's like, and I said, okay, I'm going to take you, and then I took him there, and it's just like, and he was jumping and he was flying, and my heart was just like sinking every time because I'm like, wow, this guy's going to fall, this guy's going to land, he's going to break something.
Yeah.
And I feel like, wow, I've never noticed like all the worry, all the concern, all the caring when you're little, right? When you're a young kid, all you care is basically whatever circumstances and whatever satisfies yourself, and you're not thinking, maybe my dad is actually trying to care for me. No, I mean, you're just kind of like reckless, right?
Yeah, you can't see that yet, right?
And it's the same thing now with my kids. I feel like I wanna teach them, and I want to be a good example for them. And maybe this is kind of like maybe my, coming towards the end of my questions for you, man. As you think of the next generation, of the upcoming kids of the world, my kids, your kids, Soaring, the kids that are gonna inherit this land. And even as I was, one of my previous podcasts was with Leonard Sweet, and he was saying our kids, if they were born in this century, they have a chance to make it to the next one. We probably won't make it, right?
No.
I mean, we're old enough.
I'm not going to. Yeah.
What would be something you want to leave behind for them in terms of I don't know if you want to just focus on maybe the theological side, the humanity side, the psychological side. What would be something that for sure you're like, I hope the world looks like this when they're older?
That's a great question, Beto. Wow.
Just to leave you something to think about, man.
No, it's fantastic. It's funny. This is a very common thing you hear people talk about when they have kids. They say things like, I started thinking about the world that my kids would inhabit or whatever. I haven't really gone that route very much yet, but I should. I want to, and I'm going to do it right now off the cuff. For my son himself, I hope that I can train him how to think. I hope that he can learn, how to think clearly and not be taken advantage of by people who benefit from him being an unclear thinker. And that's a real problem, I think, in global culture today. Especially with the rise of social media and a decreasing trust in institutions. I think that people have ended up becoming quite gullible, not meaning to be. And so that's one thing. Another thing is I'm deadly worried about climate change, and I don't know the kind of my son's 37 years younger than me. So that 37-year gap in terms of the climate and what that does to geopolitics and refugees and extreme poverty, I don't know. My guess is that he will live in a more chaotic world than I will have lived in. Obviously, we're overlapping quite a bit. I hope we overlap for 60 years. But he'll then probably have another 37 years that I don't have, right? And so what's that difference? And then I'll just try and answer all of them. So theologically, what kind of a world? This seems like a lot to ask right now, but I am really thirsting for, so right now I'm studying religious and spiritual abuse. That is the topic of my own dissertation work in my program. And I've started my own research on that. And one thing I'm realizing is that I am going to have to work together with traditional and conservative Christians to get anything done on this. That if I just talk to other liberals, some of them will learn some things, but they probably already agree, and they probably already have some stuff in place because liberals have those kinds of institutions, and conservatives often don't. And they are more, I think of Pentecostals and Baptists, and they're going where God leads them, and they don't want a lot of red tape. But we do need to protect people in our congregations, especially women and children. But we also need to protect ministers from that kind of abuse. And so I need to be able to work together on the ground with people that I don't agree with theologically. And right now, I mean, there are people sprouting up and kind of blowing up in terms of their careers, whose entire career is based on demonizing progressive Christians. And, there's such a pushback right now to this phenomenon of deconstruction. And I get that. I think it's natural. But what I would hope is that my son grows up in a world where there are many meaningful collaborative projects between conservative and progressive Christians, and that we will work together based on that shared identity of following Christ. So that feels kind of naive right now in 2021, but 2040, maybe not. Maybe I myself will be on the board of multiple, institutions that do that. Who knows? That would be great. I would love that.
Wow. There you go. If you're listening and you need somebody on your board, There's Dan Koch. He already committed to it. Right.
Give me a few years. Let me at least get my degree.
Man, you don't need a degree. No, you do. I'm working on mine. Man, it's a different story. But as we're talking right now, I've been sending emails upon emails back to my school in Mexico.
To get transcripts and stuff, yeah.
I finished, but I never got my actual title, the actual paper.
Yeah.
And right now I'm undergoing immigration process, which that's just another story of itself. But
yeah,
nonetheless, I'm talking to my university. And I'm like, man, I got to get this done. So I'm almost like going back to school, probably starting next month online. So luckily I can do all that sort of stuff now online.
Yeah.
But man, I got you. Papers are important. So finish. You're great, man.
Dude, I got lucky. I went back to finish my undergrad, I think right before my credits expired from before Sherwood. So I would have lost 3 years of work and had to have done it again, maybe 2.5 years. Wow. That would have been awful. I'm so glad that I acted within the 7-year period where you lose those units. And so I can't imagine. Oh, dude.
So cool, man. You're kind of disappearing on me.
I know, because of the...
You're a ghost.
We'll do one more last look at what it actually looks like back here. It's just
I like the guitars, man. If you ask me, I'm like...
The guitars look cool. The random blanket and the playpen and styrofoam and the cardboard box, those look less
all
cool
I'm looking at is the guitars and the keyboard. I'm like, oh, I dig it. I dig it. That's so cool, man. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks you for kind of like looking at the future with hope with me. And in a sense, almost like I feel like what you're doing, in a sense, it's creating that society that you want for the future. And as you do you have Permission Podcast, but then also I know you have a website, so maybe you want to point people who are deconstructing to your website.
Yeah. My friend Sari and I, we made a website called soyourdeconstructing.com, YOURE. And it's just a bunch of resources for people who are going through some doubt or questioning some parts of their faith, or maybe that word deconstructing, maybe you don't, but it's, your faith is being challenged in some way. And so there are like testimonies of what that's like for people who have gone through it and come out the other side. There is a massive topics list that each has like 15 or so resources for each topic that you might be thinking through. There's a page for communities, both digital and in person. There's a page for therapy, a page for prayer and spiritual practices that might be helpful while you go through this. Sari and I have both done a lot of faith deconstruction and a lot of reconstruction. And we very much identify with that being part of our story. And it's just resources. We're just it's just the kind of thing we wished had been around when we were going through it. That's as simple as that, really.
So good. Well, there you have it. Dan Koch from You Have Permission Podcast. I'm going to have your show also on ChristianPodcast.com as one of the feature on the directory.
Awesome.
So if you guys are listening or watching and you want to go, and just so you know, I'm looking at this other camera I have. So.
Yeah, that's fine.
Go now to ChristianPodcast.com. Check out like all of our episodes that we've had and we've done with people all across the world and other podcasters. Featuring like the Christianity label or whatever it's called. So check it out. Check Dan out. Check his website. He's a good dude. He's super smart. Go check his episodes. They're brilliant. They way more brilliant than sometimes what I can offer you. So go check him out. I don't mind if people say, man, all I got out of Beto was that he pointed me to Dan. I'm okay with that. That's good. So go check it out. Thank you, Dan, for being on the show. Do you want to say one last thought, one last word, one last whatever?
No, I think you got it, man. I'm very happy to meet you, and I'm excited. I want to be in touch about your project and how you can bridge some of those worlds a little bit. That'd
be so good, man. I already have an idea of what I'm gonna do. So thank you so much for the advice, man.
Great.
Have a great rest of your day, man, and go and keep on being the best dad ever.
I think my wife is the best mom ever, and I'm an adequate dad, is how I would say it. But I'll keep being at least adequate. Thanks, man.
All right, man. Bye-bye.
See ya.
La speranza è il futuro.